Welcome to Mindleapic. Here, in this quiet space, we share gentle historical stories meant to ease you into rest. If this channel helps you unwind at bedtime, please consider liking the video, subscribing, and pressing the bell icon so you never miss a peaceful narration. It always feels warm to know who's joining us tonight. Where are you listening from? Perhaps a city or country far away, or right here close by? Take a slow breath. Let your shoulders soften, and allow the words to drift over you like a soft blanket. Tonight, we begin a calm reflection on Ottoman household traditions, focusing on the serene, unchanging rhythms of daily life within the imperial quarters known as the harem, not as tales of excitement, but as steady patterns of routine, care, and quiet order that unfolded day after day, season after season. The imperial harem in the heart of Topkapi Palace was never meant to be a place of constant motion or bright spectacle. Instead, it was built around repetition, around the gentle turning of the same hours, the same soft footsteps along marble corridors, the same quiet voices carrying instructions that had been given in much the same way for generations. Morning light would enter slowly through latticed windows, filtered first by thin silk curtains that moved only slightly with the breeze from the Bosphorus. The air carried the faint scent of rosewater and fresh linen, nothing sharp or sudden, just a steady presence that greeted each day the same. Women rose at the same gentle hour, not hurried, but in a calm sequence. First, the attendants who kept the rooms, folding bedding with careful hands, smoothing every edge until the surfaces were even and peaceful. They worked without haste, repeating the motions they had learned long before, each fold the same as the one before, creating order that felt safe and unchanging. In the larger courtyards, where fountains played their soft, continuous trickle, the youngest residents moved in small groups to begin their morning ablutions. Water poured from copper ewers into basins of pale stone, the sound low and rhythmic, never loud enough to startle. They washed faces and hands with deliberate slowness, using soaps scented lightly, with olive oil and herbs that grew in the palace gardens. No one spoke above a murmur. Conversations, when they happened, stayed soft and brief, often repeating the same small observations about the weather or the color of the sky that morning. Breakfast arrived on trays carried along shaded walkways, flatbreads still warm from the ovens, olives gathered the day before, white cheese sliced thinly, and tea poured steaming into small glasses. Everyone ate in the same places they had the day before, sitting on cushions arranged in familiar rows. The meal passed without rush. Bites were taken slowly, sips drawn out, allowing time for the body to settle and the mind to remain quiet. Sometimes a bird would call from the cypress trees outside the walls, a single note repeated at intervals, blending into the background like everything else. After the trays were cleared, again, with the same careful stacking and carrying, the day moved into lessons. These were not rushed teachings, but slow repetitions of skills passed down year after year. In one room, calligraphy brushes dipped into ink made from soot and water, tracing the same letters over and over on paper that absorbed the strokes without complaint. The teacher would demonstrate a single curve of the letter alif, then watch as each student followed, correcting only with the lightest touch of a finger or a quiet word. Mistakes were met with patience. The same letter would be redrawn many times until the hand remembered it naturally, without effort. In another chamber, embroidery hoops held fabric stretched taut. Needles moved through silk in patterns of leaves and flowers that had decorated cushions and veils for centuries, The stitches were small and even, row after row, the same vine curling around the same blossom. Conversation here stayed light. Comments on the color of thread, the feel of the fabric, the way light fell across the work. No one hurried to finish. The goal was the steady rhythm itself, the quiet satisfaction of seeing a design grow slowly under patient hands. Further along the corridors, music lessons unfolded in much the same way. A lute or a ney would be tuned with care, strings plucked gently until the note settled true. Then simple melodies were played and replayed, the same phrases returning again and again until they flowed without thought. The listener learned by hearing the repetition, the pause between notes as important as the notes themselves. No one performed for applause. The practice was private, meant to fill the air with calm sounds that echoed softly off tiled walls. As midday approached, the palace gardens offered another layer of stillness. Paths of crushed stone wound between beds of tulips and hyacinths, planted in rows that repeated the same colors season after season. Women walked slowly, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs, pausing to touch a petal or watch a bee move from bloom to bloom. The gardeners worked nearby, clipping branches with small shears, sweeping fallen leaves into neat piles. Everything happened at the same measured pace, the snip of the shears, the rustle of the broom, the soft tread of feet on stone, all blending into a background that asked nothing of the listener but to notice and let go. Lunch followed in the same unhurried manner as breakfast. Bowls of yogurt with cucumber and mint, rice cooked with pine nuts, pieces of lamb slow roasted until tender. The food was placed on low tables, eaten with spoons or pieces of bread. Each bite savored in silence or with the quietest words. After the meal, trays were removed, floors swept clean, and the rooms returned to their perfect order once more. The afternoon brought more of the same gentle activities. Some returned to embroidery or calligraphy, others to reading from books of poetry or history, turning pages slowly, letting the words settle like dust in sunlight. In the baths, steam rose from marble pools. Water poured in steady streams from taps shaped like lions' heads. Bodies were washed with cloths dipped in scented water, movements circular and repetitive, rinsing away the day without hurry. As the sun began its slow descent, lamps were lit one by one, wicks trimmed, oil added drop by drop. Flames steadied until they burned evenly. The light was warm, golden, never bright enough to wake the eyes fully. Shadows lengthened across floors, inlaid with geometric patterns that repeated endlessly, tile after tile, the same design carrying the gaze around the room without end. Evening meals mirrored the earlier ones. Simple dishes, familiar flavors, eaten in the same places. Afterward, stories were sometimes shared, but only the quietest ones. Tales of distant gardens, of rivers flowing steadily to the sea, of stars appearing night after night in the same places. Voices stayed low, sentences flowing into one another like the fountain outside. Night settled gradually. Windows were closed against the cooler air, curtains drawn to hold the warmth inside. Beds were prepared with fresh linens, pillows arranged just so. One by one, lamps were extinguished, leaving only the softest glow from a single lantern in the hallway. The palace grew quieter still, the trickle of fountains the last sound to fade as sleep approached. And so the days continued, one much like the next, held together by these small, repeated traditions that asked for nothing more than presence and patience. The following morning arrived in the same unhurried way, as though the palace itself had decided there was no need to hurry the light or the sounds that came with it. The first call to prayer drifted over the walls from distant minarets, a low, melodic reminder that carried without insistence, fading gently into the background hum of waking birds and the steady drip of fountains. Inside the harem, the same sequence began once more. Attendants moved through the corridors with quiet purpose, their slippers whispering against the cool marble floors in patterns so familiar that no one needed to look where they stepped. They carried fresh linens folded precisely, the edges aligned perfectly, the scent of sun-dried cotton mingling with the faint trace of lavender from the storage chests. Rooms were aired one by one. Windows opened slowly to let in the morning breeze, which moved the sheer curtains in long, lazy waves before settling them back against the frames. Dust motes floated in the slanted light, drifting without direction, catching the gold of early sun, and then disappearing, again as if they had never been there. The air felt clean, steady, carrying only the softest hints of the sea and the gardens beyond. In the smaller chambers where the women prepared for the day, mirrors, framed in carved wood, reflected the same calm faces they had shown the morning before. Combs of tortoiseshell moved through long hair in slow, even strokes, section by section, the rhythm unbroken except for the occasional pause to adjust a strand that had slipped free. Hair was braided or pinned in styles that changed only with the seasons, never suddenly, always in ways that felt timeless and safe. Some chose to wear the same light caftans as the day before, fabrics of soft cotton or fine silk dyed in muted shades of rose, pale green, or cream. The cloth fell in gentle folds, moving only when the wearer moved, never rustling loudly. Buttons of pearl or small silver clasps were fastened with deliberate care, each one securing the garment in the same place it had been secured countless times. Breakfast trays appeared again along the shaded porticos, the same small glasses of tea, steam rising in thin spirals that curled and vanished. Olives rested in shallow dishes, their surfaces glossy from a light brushing of oil. Bread was torn by hand. Pieces passed quietly from one cushion to the next. Eating happened without conversation at first, allowing the simple act of tasting. Salt, warmth, the faint sweetness of dates, to fill the silence in a peaceful way. Later, as the sun climbed higher, groups gathered once more for the morning's quiet occupations. In the scriptorium-like room reserved for writing, fresh sheets of paper were laid out on low tables. Ink pots were refilled from small glass bottles, the black liquid swirling slowly before settling clear. Brushes were rinsed in water that had been left overnight to lose its chill, then dipped and lifted with the same careful motion. One woman might spend the entire morning perfecting the loop of a single letter, drawing it again and again until the curve felt as natural as breathing. The teacher sat nearby on a cushion, watching without, speaking unless a gentle correction was needed. A word like softer or a little longer here. There was no hurry to move on. The repetition itself was the lesson, the hand learning patience as much as form. Nearby, in the embroidery hall, threads were sorted into small wooden boxes, colors arranged in the same order they had always been. Deep indigo at one end, pale gold at the other. Needles were threaded with lengths measured by the span of a hand, then secured with a tiny knot. The fabric, stretched across hoops, showed half-finished designs of curling vines, pomegranate blossoms, delicate geometric borders. Patterns repeated across generations, each stitch adding to something that would outlast the hands that made it. Stitches formed in rows that followed one another without variation. The needle entered the cloth, pulled through to the other side, then returned in the same spot to create the next link in the chain. The sound was the softest whisper of thread against silk, repeated thousands of times until it became part of the room's own breathing. Occasionally, someone would pause to rethread or to smooth the fabric flat, but the pause felt natural, expected, never a break in the calm flow. In the music room, the same neigh from yesterday rested against the wall, its reed still damp from the previous day's playing. A player would pick it up, blow gently to clear any dust, then begin the same slow scale that had been practiced for weeks. The notes rose and fell in measured intervals, each one held just long enough to linger in the air before the next arrived. No one hurried the tempo. The melody unfolded like water moving over smooth stones, steady, predictable, soothing in its sameness. Outside, the gardens waited in their quiet order. Paths of pale gravel curved between low hedges of boxwood, trimmed to the same height year after year. Roses bloomed in soft clusters, petals opening slowly under the sun, releasing their scent only when the breeze turned in their direction. Gardeners moved with small sickles and watering cans, clipping spent blooms, sweeping stray leaves into piles that would later be carried away in woven baskets. Their steps were slow, deliberate, matching the pace of the plants themselves. A few women walked the paths in pairs or alone, pausing now and then to sit on stone benches warmed by the sun. They watched the water in the central pool ripple outward in perfect circles from the fall of a single drop, then watched the circles fade until the surface returned to glass-like stillness. Sometimes a leaf would drift down, settle, and float without hurry. No one spoke of hurry. The garden asked only that one remain present, breathing in time with its slow changes. As noon drew near, the call to prayer sounded again. The same words carried on the same gentle wind. Those who wished moved to small prayer rooms where mats of woven straw had been laid out in neat rows. Water was poured for ablution from the same copper vessels, hands washed in the same order, faces touched with the same quiet reverence. Prayers were offered in low voices, the familiar phrases repeated, with the same rhythm that had marked every midday for as long as memory held. Afterward, the palace returned to its midday quiet. Some rested on divans in shaded alcoves, eyes half closed, listening to the distant trickle of water and the occasional rustle of leaves. Others continued their handwork, the needle moving, the brush dipping, the thread pulling through, each motion the same as before, each one carrying the promise that tomorrow would be no different. The light shifted gradually across the tiled floors, lengthening shadows that traced the same patterns day after day. Everything remained in its place, held by the gentle weight of tradition, asking nothing more than to continue as it always had. The afternoon light in the harem courtyards softened as the hours passed, turning from clear gold to a warmer amber that seemed to settle over everything. Like a gentle veil, shadows from the cypress trees stretched longer across the stone paving, tracing the same slow arcs they had traced the day before and the day before that. The fountains continued their steady trickle, drop by drop by drop, the water catching the light in tiny, fleeting sparkles before disappearing into the basin below, only to rise again in the same endless cycle. Women who had finished their morning embroidery or calligraphy now drifted toward the shaded colonnades where divans were arranged in familiar rows, cushions of faded velvet, deep burgundy, soft teal, muted rose, had been placed in exactly the same positions for years, their tassels hanging straight and still unless a faint breeze stirred them. Some reclined there with small books of poetry open on their laps, pages turned one by one with the lightest touch of a finger. The verses spoke of gardens in bloom, of rivers flowing quietly to the sea, of moonlight resting on still waters. Words that had been read in the same low voices, season after season, never demanding attention, only offering quiet company. Others sat cross-legged on the cool tiles, continuing the handwork that had occupied them earlier. Needles moved through fabric in the same measured rhythm. In, pull through, over, in again. The thread followed predictable paths, forming petals that curled exactly as the petals before them had curled, leaves that pointed in the same gentle directions. Colors blended softly, pale pinks fading into creams, greens deepening to sage. Each shade chosen not for boldness, but for harmony, for the way it rested easy on the eye and the mind. A single row might take half an hour to complete, and no one minded. The slowness was the point. The repetition, a kind of meditation that asked nothing in return but patience. In one corner of the colonnade, a small group gathered around a low table where tea had been freshly brewed. The samovar hissed softly, steam rising in thin, lazy spirals that curled and dissolved without hurry. Glasses were filled to the same level each time, a slice of lemon placed carefully on the rim, a spoonful of sugar stirred until it vanished completely. Sips were taken slowly, the warmth spreading through the body in quiet waves, the faint bitterness of the tea balanced by the sweetness that lingered on the tongue. Conversation, when it arose, stayed light and circular. Remarks about the warmth of the sun today, compared to yesterday, the way the roses seemed a shade deeper this week, the sound of the fountain sounding just a little clearer after the morning rain that had passed without fanfare. Sentences drifted into silences that felt comfortable, not empty, and then someone would speak again in the same soft tone, picking up the thread where it had been left. Beyond the colonnades, the larger garden paths remained almost deserted in the warmest part of the day. Only a few gardeners moved there, their movements deliberate and unhurried. One carried a shallow basket lined with damp cloth, collecting fallen petals to be dried, later for sachets that would scent, linens for months to come. Another knelt beside a rose bush, snipping spent, blooms with small shears that made the gentlest click each time the blades met. The clippings fell into a pile that grew slowly, petal by petal, until the basket was carried away to a quiet corner where they would be sorted and set aside. Everything happened at the pace of growing things, slow, steady, without force. Inside the cooler halls, where thick walls kept the heat at bay, the baths waited in their marble stillness. Steam rose in faint wisps from the warm pools, the water surface unbroken except for the occasional slow ripple when a drop fell from an overhanging arch. Towels of fine linen were folded in tall stacks, their edges aligned perfectly, ready for use at any moment. A few women entered quietly, slipping out of caftans that pooled softly on the floor, then stepping down into the water with the same careful motion. One foot, then the other, letting the warmth rise gradually around ankles, calves, knees, until the body was fully enveloped. They moved to sit on the submerged benches, backs resting against smooth stone, eyes half closed as the heat worked its slow way into muscles that carried no tension to begin with. Cloths dipped in scented water. Jasmine one day, rose the next, but always light, were drawn across shoulders, arms, necks in long circular strokes. The motion repeated. Dip, draw, rinse, dip again. No rush, no scrubbing, only the gentle insistence of water, and cloth removing, the faint traces of the morning without, disturbing the calm beneath. Afterward, bodies were wrapped in fresh towels, hair combed through with wide-toothed combs of smooth wood, strands separated and smoothed until they fell straight and heavy down the back. The entire process could take an hour or more, and it always did. Time here was not measured in haste, but in the quiet completion of each small step. As the afternoon wore on, the palace seemed to breathe more slowly. Voices grew even softer, footsteps lighter, movements smaller. Some returned to their embroidery hoops, picking up exactly where they had left off hours earlier, the needle finding the same hole it had used before, the thread continuing its journey without interruption. Others sat by windows that overlooked the Bosphorus, watching the water move in long, lazy swells, ships passing far in the distance, with sails that caught the light and then let it go again. The horizon remained steady, the same line of blue meeting the same line of sky, day after unchanging day. In the quiet libraries tucked along the upper corridors, shelves held volumes bound in leather, softened by generations of careful hands. Books were taken down one at a time, opened to marked pages, read in low murmurs or in perfect silence. Illuminated letters glowed faintly in the slanting light. Gold leaf, crimson ink, lapis blue, each one painted with brushes so fine they seemed to breathe the color onto the paper. The words told of distant orchards, of poets who sat beneath the same moon, of seasons that turned in their own time without ever hurrying. Readers turned pages slowly, letting the paper rest against the fingertips, feeling the slight texture, the faint give of the binding. Before moving to the next line, evening began to gather its colors, rose fading to lavender, gold giving way to silver gray. Lamps were brought out one by one, wicks trimmed with small silver scissors. Oil poured in careful measures until the flame steadied into a soft, unwavering glow. The light spread across floors and walls in warm pools, catching the gleam of tiles, the sheen of silk cushions, the quiet shine of polished wood. Shadows lengthened further, softening every edge, blurring the boundaries between objects until the rooms felt like one continuous, gentle space. Dinner trays arrived as the sky darkened, carried along the same walkways, by the same attendants who had carried breakfast and lunch. Dishes were simple and familiar. Pilaf studded with currants, yogurt thick with herbs, bread still warm, small bowls of preserved fruit that tasted of summers long past. Eating happened in near silence, the clink of a spoon against porcelain the loudest sound. Each bite taken slowly, savored without comment. After the meal, trays were cleared with the same careful stacking, floors swept with soft brooms. Everything returned to order as though the day had never disturbed it. Night settled fully then. Windows were latched, curtains drawn across to hold the warmth close. Beds were prepared with linens smoothed flat, pillows plumped just so. One by one, lamps were extinguished until only a single lantern remained in the hallway, its light dimmed to the faintest amber. The palace grew quieter still. The fountain's trickle now the only steady sound, repeating its soft phrase through the darkness, inviting the mind to follow its rhythm down, down, into rest. And tomorrow, the same light would return, the same routines would unfold, the same gentle repetitions would hold everything in place, asking only that one continue to breathe, to notice, to let go. The palace seemed to hold its breath as the third day in this gentle cycle unfolded, no different in its quiet essence from the ones that had come before, yet carrying the same soft reassurance that nothing needed to change. Dawn arrived with the same pale light slipping through the same latticed screens, painting long, thin stripes across the marble that had already been swept clean the evening prior. The air felt cooler now, carrying the faint memory of night dew from the gardens, mixed with the ever-present whisper of rose and jasmine that never quite left the corridors. Attendants began their rounds again, moving like shadows that had learned every turn and doorway by heart. They carried basins of warm water scented with orange blossom, pouring it carefully into waiting ewers so the sound remained a low, continuous murmur rather than any sharp splash. Linens were shaken out gently, once, twice, then laid across beds or hung to air on wooden frames near open windows, where the breeze could pass through them without hurry, lifting the fabric in slow, even waves before letting it fall back into place. In the private chambers, women stirred at their own pace, some rising to kneel beside small prayer, rugs already spread in the same corner they always chose. The rugs' patterns, simple, geometrics in faded blues and ivories, had softened over years of gentle use, the fringes slightly frayed in exactly the same spots. Hands were washed again from the same copper vessels, water poured in the same slow stream over wrists and palms, droplets falling one by one onto the stone floor where they spread into tiny, perfect circles before evaporating without trace. Hair was brushed in long, deliberate strokes, the comb moving from crown to ends, section by section, smoothing away any tangle with patience that never wavered. Strands were gathered into loose, braids or simple knots secured with silk, ribbons in colors chosen long ago and never questioned. Soft mauve, pale honey, quiet sage. Mirrors reflected the same calm expressions, the same half-lowered eyelids, the same unhurried movements repeated, day after day until they became as natural as breathing. Breakfast arrived once more on the familiar trays, carried along walkways where the morning sun had already warmed the tiles underfoot. Dates arranged in small pyramids, their skins glossy and dark. Yogurt in shallow bowls swirled with threads of honey. Bread torn into pieces that fit perfectly in the palm of the hand. Tea was poured from the same long-spouted pots, steam rising in the same lazy curls. Glasses held between fingertips until the warmth spread evenly. Eating was slow, almost silent. Each bite held for a moment on the tongue before swallowing, allowing the flavors, sweet, creamy, faintly nutty, to linger without demand. After the trays were cleared away, the day settled into its familiar rhythm of handwork and quiet occupation. In the embroidery rooms, hoops were taken up exactly where they had been set down the afternoon before. Threads were re-threaded if needed. Needles found their places in pincushions lined with velvet, and the first stitch of the morning slipped through fabric with the softest sound imaginable. The design continued to grow, another leaf unfurling, another petal rounding out, each addition so small it could barely be noticed in a single sitting. Yet over weeks and months, the whole picture emerged in perfect, predictable order. One woman might spend the morning on a single border of tiny cross-stitches, counting each one under her breath, in a whisper too low to carry beyond her own cushion. The needle entered at the same angle every time, pulled through to the same tension, creating rows that aligned perfectly with the rows above. Mistakes, when they happened, were undone with the same calm patience. Thread pulled back slowly, fabric smoothed flat, then the stitch remade exactly as before. There was no frustration, only the gentle insistence that the work continue in its steady way. In the calligraphy chamber next door, ink was mixed fresh each morning, lamp-black ground with a little water until it reached the right depth of black, thick enough to hold a line, but thin enough to flow without blotting. Brushes of weasel hair or goat hair were dipped once, twice. The excess tapped lightly against the rim of the inkstone. Paper was laid flat, held in place by small weights of polished stone at each corner. A single word might occupy the entire morning. The vertical stroke of lamb, drawn from top to bottom in one smooth, unbroken motion, then repeated below it, and below that, until the page filled with the same shape rising and falling like gentle breaths. The teacher moved quietly among the low tables, offering only the softest guidance. A finger tracing the ideal curve in the air, a murmured, a little wider at the base. No one was hurried to finish. The repetition of the same letter hour after hour taught the hand to remember, without conscious thought, turning practice into something almost meditative. Further along, in rooms where music lingered like perfume, the same instruments waited on their stands. A cannon's strings were plucked one by one to check their tuning, each note held until it faded completely before moving to the next. Then the slow maqam began again. The same phrase played softly, paused, played again a fraction slower, allowing the ear to follow every nuance of the interval. Fingers moved across the frets or along the neck with deliberate care, never rushing the tempo, letting silence between notes become as important as the notes themselves. The sound drifted through open doorways, blending with the trickle of fountains until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Outside, the gardens continued their unhurried life. A gardener knelt beside a bed of iris, lifting spent stalks with gloved hands, placing them carefully into a basket lined with damp muslin. Another swept the gravel paths with a broom of fine twigs, the bristles making a soft shushing sound that rose and fell in even rhythm. Water was carried in copper cans with long spouts, poured in slow arcs over roots, so the soil absorbed it gradually without runoff. Petals that had opened fully the day before now began to loosen, drifting down one by one to rest on the ground where they would be swept up later, becoming part of the quiet cycle of growth and decay. Women walked these paths in ones and twos, slippers scuffing lightly against stone, pausing at the same benches they always chose, some overlooking the central pool, others beneath a trellis heavy with jasmine. They sat without speaking, watching water move in slow circles, watching clouds drift across the same patch of sky, watching bees move from flower to flower in their own small, predictable orbits. The air held the scent of warm earth and green leaves, unchanging, comforting in its sameness. Midday brought the familiar call to prayer, rolling gently across the rooftops. Those who wished gathered again in the small prayer rooms, mats laid out in the same rows, foreheads touching the same cool weave of straw. The movements were slow and measured, standing, bowing, prostrating, each one flowing into the next without haste. The familiar words spoken or thought in perfect unison. Afterward, hands were washed once more. Water poured in the same steady stream, droplets tracing the same paths down wrists before falling away. The palace quieted further in the warmest hours. Some retired to shaded alcoves where divans waited with cushions already arranged. Just so, eyes closed, breathing deepened, the distant fountain providing a steady pulse that matched the slow rise and fall of the chest. Others continued their work, needle in, thread through, brush dipped, letter formed, each motion smaller, slower, more absorbed into the fabric of the afternoon. As light began to slant lower, lamps were prepared again. Wicks were trimmed with tiny silver scissors. Oil poured drop by careful drop until the level was perfect. Flames caught and steadied, spreading their warm, golden glow across walls and floors in the same soft pools they had illuminated the night before. Shadows grew longer, softer, wrapping the rooms in a gentle dusk that asked nothing but surrender. Evening trays arrived with the same simple foods, eaten in the same places, cleared in the same careful way. Stories, when told, were the quietest kind. Tales of orchards ripening under steady suns, of rivers that never hurried to the sea, of stars returning to their places night after night. Voices remained low, sentences trailing into comfortable silences filled only by the fountain's endless, soothing repetition. Night drew closer. Curtains were drawn. Windows latched. Beds smoothed one final time. Lamps were dimmed until only the faintest glow remained in the hallways. The palace settled into its deepest stillness, the trickle of water the last sound to linger, repeating its calm phrase over and over, guiding every listening heart toward rest. And so the pattern held, gentle and unbroken, ready to begin again with the first light of tomorrow. The fourth morning in this unbroken chain of days dawned with the same tender reluctance, as if the sun itself preferred to linger below the horizon a little longer before allowing its light to spread across the palace roofs. When it finally arrived, the glow was pale and diffused, slipping through the same carved screens and the same slender beams that had greeted every previous sunrise. The air held a faint chill that would soon soften, carrying the quiet scent of damp stone from the night's dew and the ever-present trace of blooming night jasmine that climbed the outer walls in slow, patient tendrils. Attendants moved through the corridors once again, their steps so measured and familiar that the faint echo of slippers on marble sounded more like a continuation of silence than any real interruption. They carried trays of folded linens, each piece shaken out with the same gentle snap. Twice, always twice, before, being placed in the exact spots they had occupied the day before. Windows were opened in sequence, first the eastern ones to catch the earliest light, then those facing the gardens where the breeze arrived freshest. Curtains of fine muslin were drawn back slowly, allowing the fabric to settle in long, even pleats that caught the morning air without fluttering. In the bathing chambers, water was heated over low braziers, the copper cauldrons hissing softly as steam rose in thin, steady columns. Basins were filled drop by drop until the surface trembled only slightly, then carried to the private alcoves where women waited. The washing ritual unfolded in the same unvarying order. Face first, then hands, then forearms. Water poured from small ewers in a continuous, gentle stream that made no splash, only a low murmur against skin. Towels of soft cotton were pressed lightly, absorbing moisture without rubbing, leaving the skin warm and calm. Hair was oiled with drops of argan or almond, worked in with fingertips in slow circles from root to tip, then combed through until every strand lay smooth and heavy. Braids were formed again, 3 strands divided evenly, crossed over one another in the same repeating pattern, secured at the end with a silk cord looped twice and tied in a small flat knot. The result looked almost identical to yesterday's and the day before's, a quiet continuity that required no thought or decision. Breakfast trays were set out under the long colonnades where pillars cast repeating shadows across the floor in perfect parallel lines. The same small glasses waited, filled with tea to the same mark just below the rim. Olives glistened in their shallow dishes, arranged in neat circles. Cheese rested in thin slices fanned like petals. Bread, still carrying the warmth of the oven, was broken along the same scored lines. Eating proceeded without haste. Small bites, slow chews, pauses between sips to let the warmth settle in the chest. Sometimes a spoon rested against the edge of a bowl for a full minute, before being lifted again, the silver catching a brief gleam of light before returning to stillness. As the morning advanced, the palace returned to its familiar occupations. In the embroidery halls, hoops were adjusted on laps, fabric smoothed flat with the palm of the hand until not a single crease remained. Threads were selected from the same wooden boxes, colors arranged in the unchanging order. Whites and creams first, then the soft pastels, finally the deeper tones that appeared only in small accents. Needles were threaded by holding the silk between moistened lips to stiffen the end, then guiding it through the eye with the same careful pinch. The work continued where it had paused. Another row of chain stitch curling around a leaf, another satin stitch filling the heart of a flower. Each movement followed the last in perfect rhythm. Needle down, thread pulled through to the back, needle up through the next hole. Thread pulled taut but not tight. The sound was barely audible, a faint whisper, repeated thousands of times until it merged, with the background like the breathing of the room itself. A single blossom might take days to complete, its petals built layer by layer, each one identical in shape and spacing to the one beside it. No one counted the stitches aloud. The counting happened silently, in the steady motion of the hand. In the adjoining room dedicated to calligraphy, fresh ink was prepared once more. The inkstone was wiped clean with a damp cloth, then ground anew with the ink stick in slow, circular motions until the black deepened to the desired richness. Paper was selected from stacks wrapped in protective cloth. Sheets of the same weight, the same creamy tone, cut to the same modest size. Brushes were rinsed in a bowl of clear water, shaken once to remove excess, then dipped so the bristles formed a perfect point. A single letter might occupy the morning, the elegant sweep of ha, beginning with a gentle curve at the top, descending in a straight line that thickened slightly at the base before lifting, again in a delicate tail. The brush was lifted and set down again and again, each attempt laid beside the previous one in neat rows. The teacher passed quietly, offering only the softest nod or the lightest touch to guide a wrist that had begun to drift. There was never any urgency to move to the next letter. Mastery came from endless return to the same form, until the hand could draw it without conscious direction. Music drifted from another chamber, the same slow phrases on the oud or the nay. Each note held until its resonance faded completely before the next began. Fingers pressed strings with the same measured pressure, releasing them to let the vibration linger in the air. The melody repeated in small variations, so slight they were, felt more than heard, creating a sense of gentle unfolding rather than progression. The sound floated along corridors, blending with the trickle of water from distant fountains, until the two became one continuous, soothing pulse. In the gardens, the midday sun filtered through leaves in dappled patterns that shifted only minutely as hours passed. Gardeners continued their work. One, tying young shoots to bamboo stakes with soft twine looped in the same loose knots. Another raking gravel into fresh, even waves that mimicked the ripples of water. Watering cans were tilted slowly, allowing streams to arc gently over soil without disturbing the surface. Fallen petals were gathered in open palms, transferred to baskets, and carried away to dry in shaded corners where they would later be sewn into small sachets for drawers and cushions. Women walked the paths at their leisure, pausing at the same stone, benches where moss had begun to soften the edges over decades. They sat watching the central pool, where goldfish moved in slow, overlapping circles just below the surface, their fins fanning without haste. A leaf would detach from an overhanging branch, drift downward in a lazy spiral, touch the water, and float motionless until carried to the edge by an invisible current. No one spoke of hurry. The garden's time was measured in seasons, not moments. The call to prayer sounded again at its appointed hour, rolling softly across the rooftops like a familiar lullaby. Prayer mats were unrolled in the same quiet rooms, aligned toward the same direction, fringes smoothed flat. The sequence of standing, bowing, kneeling unfolded in measured rhythm, each posture held just long enough for breath to steady. Afterward, water was poured for ablution once more, hands dried on the same soft towels. Everything returned to its place without fuss. Afternoon settled deeper into stillness. Some rested on divans in alcoves, where light had grown warmer and more golden, eyelids heavy, breathing slow. Others continued their tasks, needle moving, brush dipping, fingers plucking strings, each action smaller and more absorbed as the day lengthened. Evening arrived gradually, colors fading from gold to rose to deep indigo. Lamps were lit with the same careful ritual. Wick trimmed, oil added, flame steadied until it burned clear and low. Dinner trays appeared with familiar dishes. Rice cooked soft with cardamom. Lentils simmered until creamy, bread torn by hand. Eating happened in near silence. Trays cleared with quiet efficiency. Floors swept until every trace of the day was gone. Night closed in softly. Curtains drawn, beds prepared, lamps extinguished one by one until darkness held the palace in its gentle embrace. The fountain's trickle continued through the hours, repeating its calm, unchanging phrase, inviting every listener to follow it deeper into rest. Tomorrow the light would return in the same way. The routines would resume without alteration. The gentle repetitions would continue to hold everything steady and safe. The fifth day opened in the same hushed manner, as though the palace had simply paused its breathing overnight and now resumed. With the lightest exhale, the first rays of sun touched the highest domes, then slid downward in slow golden fingers, finding their way once more through the same pierced marble screens that filtered light into delicate, unchanging patterns on the floors below. The air carried the cool freshness of early morning, laced with the faint, steady perfume of myrtle leaves, crushed underfoot by the night gardener and the distant salt of the Bosphorus that never quite left even the innermost rooms. Attendants glided along the corridors with their usual quiet certainty, each carrying what they had carried every morning before: folded cloths of white linen, small pitchers of rosewater, trays of polished brass that reflected nothing but soft light. Doors were opened one by one, not flung wide, but eased ajar so the hinges made only the faintest sigh. Windows followed, latches turned with deliberate slowness, allowing the morning breeze to enter in thin currents that stirred curtains without lifting them. In the bathing alcoves, water was drawn again from the same heated reservoirs, poured into marble basins until the surface lay perfectly still except for the occasional lazy ripple from a falling drop. Women stepped down into the warm pools with the same measured grace, one foot testing the temperature, then the other following, body lowering gradually until shoulders rested against smooth stone ledges worn soft by generations. Cloths were soaked and drawn across skin in long, overlapping circles, shoulder to arm, arm to wrist, neck to collarbone. Rinse, repeat. The motion never varied. The rhythm stayed even, soothing, almost hypnotic in its sameness. Afterward, bodies were wrapped in fresh towels warmed by the sun, hair parted and combed with wide wooden combs that glided without catching. Oil was applied sparingly. 3 drops worked between palms, then smoothed from roots to ends in slow strokes that left strands gleaming but never heavy. Braids were remade in the familiar 3-strand pattern, crossed and recrossed until the length was secured with a silk tie looped once, twice knotted flat against the nape. The reflection in the small hand mirrors showed the same serene face, the same lowered gaze, the same quiet acceptance of another day unfolding exactly as expected. Breakfast appeared under the long arcades where morning light had already warmed the cushions. Trays held the same modest arrangement. Small glasses of tea steaming gently, olives arranged in overlapping rings, yogurt flecked with fresh mint leaves chopped fine, flatbread torn along its natural seams into pieces that fit neatly in the hand. Sips were taken slowly, each one held in the mouth for a moment to let the warmth spread before swallowing. Bites of bread were chewed with care, allowing the faint sourdough, tang, and the subtle sweetness of sesame seeds to linger on the tongue. Silence prevailed at first, broken only later by the softest remarks. How the tea tasted a shade stronger today, how the olives seemed riper, how the light on the fountain water looked almost silver in this particular hour. When trays were cleared, stacked with the same careful balancing, carried away in the same quiet procession, the palace turned once more to its gentle pursuits. In the embroidery chambers, fabric was stretched anew across hoops, threads drawn from boxes that had not been rearranged since the week began. Needles found their rhythm again. In through the silk, out the other side, over and under in tiny, precise movements that built one stitch upon the last. A border of running stitch might grow by only a few centimeters in an entire morning. Each thread pulled to the same gentle tension, each knot hidden beneath the surface so the front remained flawless and calm. Colors blended without contrast, ivory into cream, pale rose into blush, soft green into sage, chosen for their quiet harmony rather than any desire to stand out. Conversation here remained sparse and circular, a murmur about the way the needle slipped more easily through dampened thread, a quiet observation on how the light shifted across the hoop as clouds passed overhead, a shared sigh of contentment when a row completed itself perfectly. No one hurried. The work existed to fill time with steady, predictable motion, not to reach an end. In the calligraphy room, ink was ground fresh once again, the stone circling in the same slow spirals until the mixture reached its familiar depth. Paper was smoothed flat, brushes tested against the edge of the inkwell to remove excess, then set to the page. Today, the focus might rest on the letter Ein, its rounded form beginning with a gentle dip, swelling in the middle, then tapering to a fine point that lifted without breaking contact. The brush moved again and again, each attempt laid beside the previous, in neat columns that filled the sheet without crowding. The repetition taught patience, as much as form, the hand learning to trust its own memory, the eye growing accustomed to the same graceful curve appearing over and over in perfect alignment. Music floated from another quiet corner, the same ney player breathing into the reed with the same controlled gentleness. A single phrase was repeated, 5 notes rising, 3 falling. A pause, then the phrase once more. The tempo never quickened. Each note was allowed to bloom fully, to fade completely before the next arrived. The sound wandered through open doorways, mingling with the distant fountain until it felt like part of the palace's own slow heartbeat. Out in the gardens, the sun climbed higher, warming paths of pale gravel that crunched softly underfoot. Gardeners continued their small tasks, one clipping boxwood into the same rounded shapes it had held for years, another gathering fallen camellia petals into shallow baskets lined with muslin. Water was poured from long-spouted cans in gentle arcs, soaking the earth without flooding it, allowing roots to drink slowly. A few bees moved among the roses, their hum low and constant, rising and falling like a distant lullaby. Women strolled the shaded walkways, pausing at familiar spots. A bench beneath a trellis draped in honeysuckle, a low wall overlooking the pool where water lilies floated in perfect stillness. They sat watching the same slow movements. A fish gliding beneath the surface, a leaf detaching and spiraling down, a ripple spreading outward, then fading back to calm. The air remained warm but not heavy, scented with green and earth, and the faintest salt from the water beyond the walls. No one spoke much. The garden asked only for quiet presence. Midday arrived with the familiar call drifting over the rooftops, soft and unhurried. Prayer mats were spread once more in the same rooms, aligned in the same rows, fringes smoothed with the same gentle hands. The postures flowed in measured sequence, standing tall, bowing low, kneeling, prostrating, each held long enough for breath to settle. Water followed for ablution, poured in the same steady stream, dried with the same soft cloths. Everything returned to its place as though untouched. The warmest hours brought deeper quiet. Some rested in alcoves where cushions had been arranged just so, eyes closed, breathing matching the slow drip of a nearby fountain. Others continued their work, stitch by stitch, letter by letter, note by note, each action growing smaller, slower, more completely absorbed into the afternoon's golden stillness. As light began to lengthen and soften, lamps were prepared with the same ritual care, wicks trimmed short, oil added in careful measures, flames steadied until they burned low and even. Dinner trays arrived with familiar comfort, rice soft with butter and cinnamon, vegetables stewed until tender, yogurt cool and thick. Eating unfolded in near silence, trays cleared without haste, floors swept until every surface gleamed once more. Night gathered its colors, deep rose fading to indigo, stars appearing one by one in the same familiar places. Curtains were drawn against the cooling air, beds smoothed with fresh linens, pillows arranged in the same gentle piles. Lamps dimmed gradually until only faint hallway glow remained. The fountain continued its endless trickle, repeating the same soft phrase through the darkness, guiding every mind toward deeper, quieter rest. And so the days flowed onward, each one mirroring the last, held safely within the calm, unchanging embrace of tradition. The sixth morning arrived with the same quiet reluctance of light, as if the palace preferred the gentle gray of pre-dawn, a little longer before yielding to full day. When the sun finally crested the distant hills, its rays touched the highest minarets first, then descended in slow, warming bands across tiled roofs and down into the sheltered courtyards. The air remained cool and still, holding the faint moisture of night and the steady, low fragrance of damp cypress, needles, and the last of the evening blooming jasmine that clung to the outer trellises. Attendants began their rounds in the familiar sequence, footsteps so soft on marble that they blended into the background, like the distant call of a single morning dove, They carried the same small burdens. Pitchers of lukewarm water, scented with a single drop of attar, stacks of linen folded in perfect squares, trays of brass polished to a soft, non-reflective sheen. Doors were eased open with the lightest pressure on the latch. Windows unlatched one by one in the same order, east-facing first to welcome the earliest breeze, then south to catch the warming sun. Curtains of thin silk were drawn aside slowly, fabric pooling in gentle folds at the sill before settling into long, even drapes that filtered light without dimming it. In the bathing rooms, steam rose and faint. Lazy wisps from marble basins filled drop by careful drop. Women entered the warm water with the same unhurried step, toes testing the surface, then lowering until the warmth enveloped calves, thighs, waist, shoulders. The pools held their stillness, except for the tiniest ripples when a hand moved to lift water and let it pour over arms in slow cascades. Cloths of fine linen were dipped, wrung lightly, then drawn across skin in wide, overlapping arcs, shoulder to elbow, elbow to wrist, neck to collarbone. Rinse, repeat. The motion remained circular, even, never hurried. The warmth worked gradually into every muscle until the body felt weightless, held safely by water and stone. After the bath, towels warmed on heated racks were wrapped around shoulders and hips, absorbing moisture without pressure. Hair was parted down the center with a comb of smooth horn, oiled with 3 measured drops worked between palms, then smoothed from scalp to ends in long, repeating strokes. Braids were formed again. 3 even sections crossed over one another in the same slow rhythm, pulled gently taut, secured at the bottom with a narrow silk ribbon tied in a flat bow that lay flush against the back. The mirror showed the same calm profile, the same half-lidded eyes, the same expression of quiet acceptance that needed no words. Breakfast trays were arranged once more beneath the colonnades, where morning sun had begun to trace the same golden lines across the floor tiles. Glasses of tea stood steaming in their tulip shapes, filled to the same precise level. Olives rested in small porcelain dishes, arranged in overlapping circles. Yogurt was swirled with a thread of dark honey. Bread lay torn into irregular pieces, still carrying the oven's faint warmth. Eating proceeded in measured silence at first. Small sips held on the tongue, bites chewed slowly until flavors unfolded fully, then softened into the gentlest murmurs. How the honey tasted a touch more floral today, how the bread seemed lighter, how the light on the water in the fountain caught the eye just so. Trays were cleared in the same careful order. Plates stacked without clatter, glasses nested inside one another. Everything carried away on balanced trays that made no sound against the stone. The palace then settled deeper into its daily calm. In the embroidery halls, hoops were lifted from yesterday's exact positions. Fabric smoothed flat with open palms until every wrinkle disappeared. Threads were selected from the unchanging wooden boxes. Pale ivory first, then the softest rose, then muted greens that echoed the garden leaves outside. Needles were threaded with the same moistened tip, guided through the eye with a gentle pinch, then set to work. Stitches continued in their familiar paths, chain stitch curling into another leaf vein, satin stitch filling a petal by petal. French knots clustered in small, even groups for the centers of blossoms. Each movement followed the last without variation. Needle piercing down, thread drawn through to the back, needle rising through the next hole, thread pulled to the same gentle tension. A single flower head might advance by only a centimeter or 2 in hours of work, its form growing so gradually that change was felt more than seen. Conversation drifted in whispers. A quiet note on how the thread caught the light differently in this angle. A shared observation about the way the needle glided more smoothly after, resting overnight. A soft sigh when a row aligned perfectly with the one above. The rhythm never broke. The work existed to occupy hands and mind in peaceful repetition. In the calligraphy chamber, ink was prepared anew. The stick circling the stone in slow, meditative loops until black deepened to velvet richness. Paper was laid flat, corners weighted with small polished stones worn smooth by years of use. Brushes were rinsed in clear water, shaken once, dipped, so bristles formed a fine point, then lifted to the page. The morning's focus might rest on the letter Wa. It's rounded bowl beginning with a gentle upward flick, swelling into a full circle, then descending in a straight tail that tapered to nothing. The brush moved again and again, each version placed beside the last in tidy rows that filled the sheet without haste. The repetition taught the wrist to relax, the eye to trust the same curve appearing over and over, until the form felt inevitable rather than drawn. From another room came the same slow notes on the kanun or oud. Phrases played softly, paused, played once more with the slightest shift in pressure, allowing each string to resonate fully before the next joined. The melody circled back on itself, never rushing forward, creating a sense of gentle return rather than arrival. The sound wandered through doorways and along corridors, mingling with the fountain's trickle until both became one unbroken, calming thread. In the gardens, sunlight filtered through leaves in shifting but predictable patterns. Gardeners moved with small tools. One, pruning spent rose canes with secateurs that clicked softly once per cut. Another raking gravel into fresh, shallow waves that mimicked water without effort. Watering cans tilted in slow arcs, streams soaking earth in measured doses so roots drank without drowning. Petals, loosened by the morning breeze, drifted down one by one, caught in open baskets or left to rest where they fell until swept later into neat piles. Women walked the paths at their own pace, pausing at the same low benches where stone had warmed under the sun. They sat watching the pool's surface. Goldfish gliding in lazy loops, water lilies opening petal by petal, a single fallen leaf floating motionless until nudged by an invisible current. The air held green and earth and faint sea salt, unchanging, comforting in its familiarity. No words were needed. The garden simply invited quiet being. Midday prayer called again, soft and rolling across the rooftops. Mats were spread in the same rooms, aligned in familiar rows. Postures flowed in measured time. Rise, bow, kneel, prostrate. Each held long enough for breath to find its own rhythm. Water poured for ablution afterward. Hands dried on soft towels. Everything folded and returned without disturbance. The afternoon deepened into golden quiet. Some rested in shaded alcoves, cushions cradling the body, eyelids heavy, breathing slow and even. Others continued their tasks, stitch following stitch, letter following letter, note following note. Each motion growing tinier, slower, more completely dissolved into the warm stillness. Evening gathered in soft layers, rose fading to lavender, gold to silver gray. Lamps were lit with the same steady care. Wick trimmed, oil poured drop by drop. Flame steadied low. Dinner trays arrived with familiar comfort. Pilaf soft with saffron, eggplant stewed until melting. Yogurt cool and plain. Eating happened quietly. Trays cleared without rush. Floors swept until every trace vanished. Night settled fully. Curtains drawn, beds smoothed, lamps dimmed until only hallway glow remained. The fountain's trickle continued through the dark hours, repeating its gentle, endless phrase, drawing every listening soul deeper into peaceful rest. Tomorrow the same dawn would come. The same routines would unfold. The same calm repetitions would hold the world steady and safe once more. The seventh morning unfolded with the same soft reluctance, the palace seeming to wake only because the light insisted, slipping through the latticed windows in the same thin, golden threads it had used every day before. The sky remained pale for a long while, holding on to the last traces of night until the sun rose higher and began to warm the stone. Courtyards one slow degree at a time. The air felt clean and slightly damp, carrying the quiet scent of wet leaves from the garden paths and the ever-present whisper of rosewater that lingered in every corridor, like an old, familiar memory. Attendants moved through their morning tasks in the same measured rhythm, footsteps barely audible on the cool marble, each step placed exactly where the last one had been. They carried pitchers filled with water, warmed just enough to take the chill from the morning, linens folded into perfect rectangles with edges aligned to the millimeter, small trays of brass that caught the light without shining too brightly. Doors were opened gently, latches turned with the lightest touch, so they made only a faint click before silence returned. Windows followed in their usual order. First those facing the rising sun, then the ones looking out over the gardens where the breeze arrived freshest and softest. Curtains of pale silk were drawn back inch by inch, fabric settling into long, even pleats that swayed once or twice before coming to rest. In the bathing chambers, steam rose in thin, patient columns from the marble pools. Water poured drop by drop until the surface lay mirror smooth, except for the occasional tiny circle from a falling droplet. Women entered the warmth with the same unhurried grace. One foot lowered slowly, testing, then the other, body sinking gradually, until the water reached the shoulders and the stone ledge cradled the back. Perfectly. Cloths were soaked, wrung just enough to stop dripping, then drawn across skin in wide, repeating circles across the shoulders, down the arms, along the collarbone, rinse in the warm water, repeat. The motion stayed even, never quickening, allowing the heat to seep in layer by layer until every part of the body felt held and calm. Towels were wrapped afterward, soft, sun-warmed cotton pressed lightly against skin to absorb without rubbing. Hair was combed in long, deliberate strokes from crown to ends, parted cleanly down the middle, then oiled with the same measured drops worked between warm palms and smoothed through strand by strand. Braids were remade in the familiar pattern. 3 sections divided evenly, crossed over one another in slow succession, pulled gently taut, finished with a silk cord tied twice and knotted flat so it lay smooth against the neck. The small hand mirrors reflected the same peaceful face, eyes half lowered, expression unchanging, ready for another day that asked nothing new. Breakfast trays were set. Beneath the colonnades where sunlight now painted repeating, stripes across the floor in warm gold. Glasses of tea stood steaming in their delicate shapes, filled to the same mark every time. Olives were arranged in small concentric rings on porcelain dishes. Yogurt rested thick and cool, swirled once with a thin ribbon of honey. Bread lay torn into pieces that fit the curve of the palm exactly. Eating moved at its own slow pace, sips drawn out so the warmth spread through the chest, bites held on the tongue until the flavors unfolded fully. The faint salt of the olives, the creamy tang of the yogurt, the subtle, nutty warmth of the bread. Silence held for long stretches, broken only by the softest comments later, how the tea carried a hint more bergamot today, how the olives tasted riper after last night's dew, how the light on the fountain seemed to dance a little slower this morning. Trays were cleared with the same quiet care. Plates nested without sound, glasses stacked inside one another, everything balanced on trays and carried away in steady procession. The palace then returned to its gentle daily occupations. In the embroidery rooms, hoops were taken up from their exact places, fabric smoothed flat with open hands until every crease vanished. Threads were drawn from the same wooden boxes, arranged in their unchanging order. Soft whites and creams at one end, pale pastels in the middle, deeper but muted tones at the far side. Needles were threaded with the familiar moistened tip, guided through the tiny eye, then set to the cloth. The work continued without break. Another row of stem stitch tracing a vine, another satin stitch filling the curve of a leaf. Small French knots clustered for the heart of a flower. Each stitch followed the last in perfect rhythm. Needle down through silk, thread pulled through to the back, needle up through the next hole, thread drawn to the same even tension. A single petal might grow by only a few millimeters over hours, its shape so gradual that progress felt more like breathing than doing. Whispers drifted between cushions, a quiet word about how the thread felt smoother after resting overnight, a shared note on the way light caught the silk differently, as clouds moved slowly overhead, a gentle sigh when a row completed itself in flawless alignment. The rhythm never faltered. The stitches existed to fill time with calm, predictable motion. In the calligraphy chamber, ink was ground fresh, the stick moving in slow, meditative circles against the stone until black reached its familiar velvet depth. Paper was laid flat, corners held by the same small polished stones. Brushes were rinsed, shaken once, dipped to form a perfect point, then lifted to the page. The morning might center on the letter Ba, its dot placed precisely below the curve, the bowl swelling gently, then tapering to a fine upward flick. The brush moved again and again, each attempt laid in neat columns beside the last, filling the sheet row by row without crowding. The repetition allowed the hand to relax completely, the eye to trust the same form, appearing over and over until it felt as natural as a heartbeat. Music wandered from another quiet room. The same slow phrases on the ney or oud, notes held long enough to fade fully before the next arrived. Fingers pressed strings with measured pressure, releasing them to let vibration linger in the air. The melody circled gently, returning to the same phrases with the slightest variation in breath or touch, creating a sense of endless, soothing return. The sound drifted along hallways, blending with the fountain's trickle until the two became one continuous, calming presence. Out in the gardens, sunlight filtered through leaves in soft, shifting patterns that changed only minutely as hours passed. Gardeners continued their small, steady tasks, one tying jasmine vines to trellises with soft twine looped in the same loose knots, another sweeping gravel paths with a broom of fine twigs that made a gentle, shushing sound rising and falling in even rhythm. Water poured from long-spouted cans in slow, careful arcs, soaking soil without disturbing the surface. Petals, loosened by the breeze, drifted down lazily, caught in open baskets or left to rest on the ground until gathered later. Women walked the shaded paths at their leisure, pausing at the same stone benches warmed by the sun. They sat watching the central pool, goldfish gliding in overlapping circles just below the waterline, lilies floating motionless, a single leaf spiraling down to touch the surface and drift without hurry. The air remained warm, scented with green leaves, earth, and the faintest breath of sea from beyond the walls. No conversation was needed. The garden simply held space for quiet presence. The midday call to prayer rolled softly across the rooftops once more. Mats were unrolled in the same rooms, aligned in familiar rows. Postures moved through their measured sequence, standing, bowing, kneeling, prostrating, each held long enough for breath to settle. Water followed for ablution, poured in the same gentle stream, dried with soft towels folded neatly afterward. Everything returned to stillness as though never disturbed. Afternoon deepened into golden quiet. Some rested in alcoves where cushions cradled the body perfectly, eyes closed, breathing slow and even. Others continued their gentle work, needle piercing, brush dipping, fingers plucking strings, each motion growing smaller, slower, more completely merged with the warm, unchanging light. Evening arrived in soft layers, gold fading to rose, rose to lavender, lavender to deep indigo. Lamps were prepared with the same ritual. Wick trimmed short, oil added drop by drop. Flame steadied until it burned low and clear. Dinner trays brought familiar comfort. Rice cooked soft with cardamom pods. Lentils simmered until creamy. Bread still warm from the oven. Eating unfolded in near silence. Trays cleared without haste. Floors swept until every surface gleamed once again. Night closed in gently. Curtains drawn against the cooling air. Beds smoothed with fresh linens. Pillows arranged in the same soft piles. Lamps dimmed one by one, until only the faintest hallway glow remained. The fountain's trickle continued through the darkness, repeating its calm, endless phrase over and over, guiding every listener deeper into peaceful, unbroken rest. And tomorrow the same gentle dawn would return. The same routines would resume without alteration. The same soothing repetitions would keep everything held safely in place. The 8th morning came forward in the same hushed, unhurried way, the palace holding on to the soft gray veil of dawn as long as it could, before the first true light began its slow descent across the domes and courtyards. When the sun finally rose higher, its rays filtered through the same carved screens, in the same delicate, repeating patterns, long, slender lines of gold that stretched across marble, floors already swept clean the night before. The air felt cool and clean, carrying the faint, steady trace of dew on the garden leaves, and the ever-present whisper of rose attar that had settled into every stone and fabric over decades. Attendants resumed their rounds with the same quiet certainty. Steps so light on the corridors that they seemed part of the palace's own breathing. They carried pitchers of water warmed gently overnight, linens folded into exact squares with corners aligned perfectly, small brass trays that reflected only the softest glow. Doors were opened one by one with the lightest turn of the latch. Windows unlatched in their familiar sequence. East first to greet the rising sun, then those facing the Bosphorus, where the morning breeze arrived freshest. Curtains of fine muslin were drawn back slowly, fabric settling into long, even pleats that caught the light without fluttering. In the bathing alcoves, steam rose in thin, patient wisps from marble basins, filled drop by careful drop until the water lay perfectly still. Women stepped down into the warmth with measured grace. one foot lowered to test the temperature, then the other, body sinking gradually until shoulders rested against the smooth, worn stone ledges. Cloths of soft linen were dipped, wrung lightly, then drawn across skin in wide repeating circles. Shoulders to arms, arms to wrists, neck to collarbone. Rinse in the warm water. Repeat once more. The motion stayed circular and even, never quickening, allowing the heat to work its way in slowly until the entire body felt enveloped, weightless, held in perfect calm. Towels warmed on heated racks were wrapped around shoulders and hips, absorbing moisture without any pressure. Hair was parted down the center with a smooth comb, oiled with exactly 3 drops rubbed between palms, then smoothed from roots to ends in long, deliberate strokes that left every strand lying straight and heavy. Braids were formed again in the unchanging 3-strand pattern. Sections divided evenly, crossed over one another in slow succession, pulled gently taut, secured at the end with a narrow silk ribbon tied twice and knotted flat against the nape. The small mirrors reflected the same serene profile, eyes half lowered, expression peaceful and unchanged, ready for the day to unfold exactly as before. Breakfast trays were arranged. Beneath the long colonnades where sunlight now traced the same warm stripes across the tiles. Glasses of tea stood steaming in their tulip shapes, filled to the same precise level every morning. Olives rested in shallow dishes arranged in neat, overlapping rings. Yogurt lay thick and cool, swirled once with a thin thread of honey. Bread was torn along its natural lines into pieces that fit perfectly in the hand. Eating proceeded without haste. Sips, held on the tongue to let warmth spread through the chest. Bites chewed slowly until flavors revealed themselves fully. The gentle salt of olives, the creamy mildness of yogurt, the faint, nutty warmth of sesame on the bread. Silence held for long minutes, broken only later by the quietest murmurs. How the tea carried, a subtle note of cardamom today. How the olives tasted a shade sweeter after the night air. How the fountain's light seemed softer in this particular hour. Trays were cleared in the same careful sequence. Plates stacked without clatter. Glasses nested inside one another. Everything balanced on trays and carried away in steady, silent procession. The palace then returned fully to its gentle daily rhythm. In the embroidery chambers, hoops were lifted from their exact overnight positions. Fabric smoothed flat with open palms until not a single crease remained. Threads were selected from the familiar wooden boxes, colors laid out in their unchanging order. Soft whites and creams first, pale pastels next, muted deeper tones at the far end. Needles were threaded with the same moistened tip guided through the eye, then set to the silk. The work continued, precisely where it had paused. Another row of chain stitch curling around a vine tendril. Another satin stitch filling the rounded heart of a pomegranate blossom. Small seed stitches clustered in even groups for tiny accents. Each movement repeated without variation. Needle piercing down through fabric, thread drawn through to the back, needle rising through the next tiny hole, thread pulled to the same gentle tension. A single leaf might advance by only a few millimeters over the course of hours, its shape emerging so gradually that change felt almost invisible. Whispers passed between the cushions, a soft remark on how the silk caught the shifting light as clouds drifted slowly overhead, a quiet note about the needle gliding more easily after a night's rest, a gentle breath of satisfaction when a row aligned itself perfectly with the one before. The rhythm remained unbroken. The stitches existed simply to occupy hands and mind in peaceful, predictable motion. In the calligraphy room, Ink was prepared fresh once more, the stick circling the stone in slow, meditative loops until black deepened to its familiar, rich velvet. Paper was laid flat on low tables, corners held by the same small polished stones worn smooth over years. Brushes were rinsed in clear water, shaken once to remove excess, dipped so bristles formed a fine, even point, then lifted to the page. The morning's quiet focus might rest on the letter None, its rounded bowl beginning with a gentle downward curve, swelling slightly, then lifting in a delicate upward tail. The brush moved again and again, each attempt placed beside the previous in tidy columns that filled the sheet row by row without haste or crowding. The repetition allowed the wrist to soften completely, the eye to rest on the same graceful form, appearing over and over until drawing it felt as natural and effortless as breathing. From a nearby chamber came the same slow, circling melody on the oud or kanun. Phrases played softly, each note held until its resonance faded entirely before the next arrived. Fingers moved across strings with measured pressure, releasing them to let vibration linger in the warm air. The tune returned to familiar passages with only the slightest shift in breath or touch, creating a gentle sense of return rather than forward motion. The sound wandered along corridors and through open doorways, blending seamlessly with the fountain's endless trickle until the two became one soothing, continuous presence. In the gardens, sunlight filtered through leaves in soft, dappled patterns that shifted only minutely as the hours passed. Gardeners continued their small, steady tasks. One clipping faded blooms from rows, bushes with small shears that clicked softly once per cut. Another raking gravel paths into fresh, shallow waves that mimicked calm water. Watering cans were tilted in slow, careful arcs, streams soaking the earth without runoff, allowing roots to drink gradually. Petals, loosened by the gentle breeze, drifted down one by one, caught in open baskets lined with muslin or left to rest on the ground until swept, later into neat piles. Women walked the shaded paths at their own unhurried pace, pausing at the same low stone benches where moss had softened the edges over time. They sat watching the central pool, goldfish gliding in lazy, overlapping circles beneath the surface, water lilies floating motionless with petals half open, a single fallen leaf spiraling down to touch the water and drift without hurry. The air held the scent of warm earth, green leaves, and the faintest breath of salt from the distant water beyond the walls. No words passed between them. The garden simply offered quiet space for being present. The midday call to prayer drifted across the rooftops once more, soft and rolling like a familiar lullaby. Prayer mats were spread in the same quiet rooms, aligned in the same familiar rows. Postures flowed through their measured sequence, standing tall, bowing low, kneeling, prostrating. Each held long enough for breath to find its own calm rhythm. Water was poured afterward for ablution in the same gentle stream. Hands dried on soft folded towels. Everything returned to its place without the slightest disturbance. The afternoon settled deeper into golden stillness. Some rested in shaded alcoves where cushions had been arranged just so, cradling the body perfectly, eyelids growing heavy, breathing slow and even. Others continued their gentle occupations, needle moving through silk, brush dipping into ink, fingers plucking strings, each action growing tinier, slower, more completely absorbed into the warm, unchanging light. Evening gathered in soft, gradual layers, gold softening to rose, rose fading to lavender, lavender deepening to indigo, Lamps were prepared with the same steady ritual. Wick trimmed short with small silver scissors. Oil added drop by careful drop. Flame steadied until it burned low and clear. Dinner trays arrived with familiar, simple comfort. Pilaf, cooked soft with threads of saffron. Vegetables stewed until melting tender. Yogurt, plain and cool. Eating unfolded in near silence. Trays cleared without rush. Floors swept until every surface gleamed once more. Night drew closer gently. Curtains were drawn against the cooling air. Beds smoothed with fresh linens. Pillows arranged in the same soft, comforting piles. Lamps dimmed one by one, until only the faintest amber glow remained in the hallways. The fountain's trickle continued through the dark hours, repeating its calm, unchanging phrase over and over, guiding every listening heart deeper into peaceful, dreamless rest. And tomorrow the same tender dawn would arrive. The same routines would resume without the slightest alteration. The same soothing repetitions would hold the world steady, safe and quiet once more. The ninth morning slipped in with the same gentle hush, the palace seeming to linger in the soft half-light of dawn as though reluctant to disturb the quiet that had settled overnight. When the first true rays finally appeared, they touched the highest rooftops in pale gold, then descended slowly across the courtyards in the same familiar paths, filtering through latticed screens to draw long, slender lines of warmth on marble floors already swept smooth the evening before. The air remained cool and still, holding the faint dampness of night on the garden leaves and the unchanging, low perfume of rosewater that had become part of every corridor and chamber. Attendants began their rounds once more, footsteps so light they blended into the palace's own slow breathing. They carried pitchers of water warmed just enough to gentle the morning chill, linens folded into precise rectangles with every edge aligned, small brass trays polished to a soft, subdued gleam. Doors were eased open with the lightest pressure on the latch, windows unlatched in their unchanging order, those facing east, first to welcome the rising sun, then the ones overlooking the gardens where the breeze arrived, freshest and calmest. Curtains of pale silk were drawn back inch by inch, fabric settling into long, even drapes that caught the light without any sudden movement. In the bathing rooms, steam rose in thin, patient columns from marble basins filled, drop by careful drop until the surface rested mirror flat. Women stepped into the warm water with the same measured step, one foot lowered to test the temperature, then the other, body sinking gradually until shoulders met the smooth, time-worn stone ledges. Cloths of fine linen were soaked, wrung lightly to stop dripping, then drawn across skin in wide, repeating circles, shoulders to arms, arms to wrists, neck to collarbone. Rinse in the warm water, repeat again. The motion stayed even and circular, never hurrying, letting the warmth seep in layer by layer until the body felt completely held, weightless and at rest. Towels warmed on heated racks were wrapped softly around shoulders and hips, absorbing moisture without rubbing. Hair was parted cleanly down the center with a smooth comb, oiled with the same 3 measured drops rubbed between palms, then smoothed from roots to ends in long, deliberate strokes that left strands lying straight and heavy. Braids were remade in the familiar 3-strand pattern, sections divided evenly, crossed over one another in slow, steady succession, pulled gently taut, finished with a narrow silk ribbon tied twice, and knotted flat so it rested smooth against the neck. The small hand mirrors showed the same calm face, eyes half lowered, expression serene and steady, prepared for another day that would mirror the last in every gentle detail. Breakfast trays were set out, beneath the colonnades, where morning sun now painted, the same warm, repeating stripes across the floor tiles. Glasses of tea stood steaming in their delicate tulip shapes, filled to the same precise level as always. Olives rested in small porcelain dishes arranged in neat concentric rings. Yogurt lay thick and cool, swirled once with a thin ribbon of honey. Bread was torn along, its natural seams into pieces that fit perfectly in the curve of the hand. Eating moved at its own slow, unhurried pace. Sips drawn out so the warmth spread gradually through the chest. Bites chewed carefully until flavors unfolded fully. The soft salt of olives, the creamy mildness of yogurt, the faint, nutty warmth of sesame seeds on the bread. Silence held comfortably for long stretches, broken only later by the quietest remarks. How the tea carried, a subtle hint of clove today. How the olives tasted a touch more plump after the night's dew. How the light reflecting from the fountain. Water seemed almost silver in this particular moment. Trays were cleared with the same careful order. Plates nested without sound. Glasses stacked inside one another. Everything balanced on trays and carried away in steady, silent procession. The palace then settled deeper into its familiar daily calm. In the embroidery halls, hoops were lifted from their exact places. Fabric smoothed flat with open palms until every wrinkle disappeared completely. Threads were drawn from the same wooden boxes, colors arranged in their unchanging sequence. Soft whites and creams at one end, pale pastels in the middle, muted, deeper tones at the far side. Needles were threaded with a familiar moistened tip, guided through the tiny eye with a gentle pinch, then set to the silk once more. The work continued exactly where it had left. Off, another row of chain, stitch tracing the curve of a vine. Another satin stitch filling the rounded form of a blossom petal by petal. Small French knots clustered in even groups for delicate centers. Each movement repeated without variation. Needle piercing down through fabric, thread drawn through to the back, needle rising through the next small hole, thread pulled to the same gentle, even tension. A single flower might grow by only a few millimeters over hours of quiet work, its shape emerging so gradually that progress felt more like a slow breath than any deliberate action. Whispers drifted softly between the cushions. A quiet word about how the thread caught the shifting light as clouds passed. Overhead without hurry, a shared note on the way the needle slipped more smoothly after resting overnight. A gentle sigh of contentment when a row aligned itself perfectly with the one above. The rhythm never faltered. The stitches existed simply to fill time with calm, predictable, soothing motion. In the calligraphy chamber, ink was ground fresh, the stick moving in slow, meditative circles against the stone until black reached its familiar rich depth. Paper was laid flat on low tables, corners held by the same small polished stones worn smooth by years of gentle use. Brushes were rinsed in clear water, shaken once to remove excess, dipped, so bristles formed a perfect fine point, then lifted to the page. The morning's focus might rest on the letter Ta, its vertical stroke, beginning with a gentle upward flick, descending straight and firm, then lifting again in a delicate curve. The brush moved again and again, each attempt laid beside the previous in tidy columns that filled the sheet, row by row without crowding or haste. The repetition allowed the wrist to soften completely, the eye to rest on the same graceful form, appearing over and over until drawing it felt as natural and effortless as inhaling and exhaling. Music drifted from another quiet room. The same slow phrases on the ney or kanun, each note held long enough to fade fully before the next arrived. Fingers pressed strings with measured, unvarying pressure, releasing them to let vibration linger in the warm air. The melody circled back to familiar passages with only the slightest shift in breath or touch, creating a gentle sense of return and comfort rather than any forward rush. The sound floated along hallways, blending with the fountain's endless trickle until the two became one unbroken, calming thread that filled the palace without effort. In the gardens, sunlight filtered through leaves in soft, predictable dappled patterns that changed only minutely as the day advanced. Gardeners continued their small, steady tasks. One, pruning spent rose canes with shears that clicked softly once per cut. Another sweeping gravel paths with a broom of fine twigs that made a gentle, shushing sound rising and falling in even rhythm. Watering cans tilted in slow, careful arcs. Streams soaking the earth without disturbing the surface, allowing roots to drink gradually and deeply. Petals loosened by the gentle breeze drifted down lazily, caught in open baskets, or left to rest on the ground until gathered later into neat piles. Women walked the shaded paths at their leisure, pausing at the same low stone benches where moss had softened the edges over decades. They sat watching the central pool, goldfish gliding in lazy, overlapping circles. Just below the waterline, water lilies floating motionless with petals half opened, a single fallen leaf spiraling down to touch the surface and drift without hurry. The air remained warm and scented with green leaves, warm earth, and the faintest trace of salt from the distant Bosphorus beyond the walls. No conversation passed. The garden simply held a quiet space for presence and breath. The midday call to prayer rolled softly across the rooftops again, gentle and familiar. Prayer mats were spread in the same quiet rooms, aligned in the same familiar rows. Postures moved through their measured sequence, standing tall, bowing low, kneeling, prostrating. Each held long enough for breath to settle into its own calm rhythm. Water was poured afterward for ablution in the same gentle stream. Hands dried on soft folded towels. Everything returned to its place without the slightest ripple. Afternoon deepened into golden stillness. Some rested in shaded alcoves where cushions cradled the body perfectly, eyelids growing heavier, breathing slow and even. Others continued their gentle work, needle moving through silk, brush dipping into ink, fingers plucking strings, each motion growing tinier, slower, more completely dissolved into the warm, unchanging light. Evening gathered in soft, gradual layers, gold softening to rose, rose fading to lavender, lavender deepening to deep indigo. Lamps were prepared with the same steady ritual. Wick trimmed short with small silver scissors. Oil added drop by careful drop. Flame steadied until it burned low and clear. Dinner trays arrived with familiar, simple comfort. Rice, cooked soft with threads of saffron. Lentils simmered until creamy. Bread still warm from the oven. Eating unfolded in near silence. Trays cleared without rush. Floors swept until every surface gleamed once again. Night drew closer gently. Curtains were drawn against the cooling air. Beds smoothed with fresh linens. Pillows arranged in the same soft, comforting piles. Lamps dimmed one by one until only the faintest amber glow remained in the hallways. The fountain's trickle continued through the dark hours, repeating its calm, unchanging phrase over and over, guiding every listening soul deeper into peaceful, unbroken rest. And tomorrow the same tender dawn would return. The same routines would resume without alteration. The same soothing repetitions would hold everything steady, safe and quiet once more. The 10th morning arrived in the same tender hush, the palace seeming to breathe more slowly as the days blended one into another without any sharp edge or noticeable break. Dawn held its pale gray veil a little longer still, the first light creeping across rooftops in soft, gradual waves before slipping through the latticed screens to trace the same slender, golden lines across marble, floors that had known no other pattern for centuries. The air stayed cool and clean, carrying the faint, unchanging scent of night-dampened myrtle leaves from the gardens and the ever-present whisper of rose attar that had long since soaked into every stone, every curtain, every thread of silk. Attendants moved through the corridors with their familiar quiet certainty, footsteps so soft they merged completely with the palace's own low, steady rhythm. They carried pitchers of water warmed gently to just above the morning chill, linens folded into perfect squares with corners aligned to the same invisible measure, small brass trays that caught light only in muted, comforting gleams. Doors were opened one by one with the lightest turn of the latch, windows unlatched in their unchanging sequence, east facing first to greet the sun's earliest touch, then those looking out over the gardens where the breeze arrived, freshest and softest. Curtains of fine muslin were drawn back slowly, fabric settling into long, even pleats that swayed once, twice, then came to perfect rest. In the bathing chambers, steam rose in thin, patient. Wisps from marble basins filled drop by. Careful drop until the water surface lay completely still except for the occasional tiny circle from a single falling droplet. Women entered the warmth with the same unhurried grace, one foot lowered to test, then the other following, body sinking gradually until shoulders rested against the smooth, time-polished stone ledges. Cloths of soft linen were dipped, wrung just enough to stop excess dripping, then drawn across skin in wide, repeating circles, shoulder to arm, arm to wrist, neck to collarbone. Rinse in the warm water. Repeat once more. The motion remained circular, even, never quickening. The heat worked its way in slowly, layer by layer, until the body felt fully cradled, weightless, held in absolute calm. Towels warmed on heated racks were wrapped softly around shoulders and hips, absorbing moisture without any pressure at all. Hair was parted down the center with a smooth comb of horn or wood, oiled with exactly 3 measured drops worked between warm palms, then smoothed from roots to ends in long, deliberate strokes that left every strand lying straight, heavy and gleaming softly. Braids were formed again in the unchanging 3-strand pattern. Sections divided evenly, crossed over one another in slow, steady succession, pulled gently taut, secured at the bottom with a narrow silk ribbon tied twice, and knotted flat so it rested smooth against the nape. The small hand mirrors reflected the same peaceful profile, eyes half lowered, expression serene and steady, ready for the day to continue exactly as it always had. Breakfast trays were arranged once more, beneath the long colonnades where sunlight now painted the same warm, repeating stripes across the floor tiles in soft gold. Glasses of tea stood steaming in their delicate tulip shapes, filled to the same precise level every morning without fail. Olives rested in small porcelain dishes arranged in neat, overlapping rings. Yogurt lay thick and cool, swirled once with a thin thread of honey that caught the light. Bread was torn along, its natural seams into pieces that fit perfectly in the curve of the hand. Eating proceeded without any haste. Sips, drawn out so the warmth spread. Gradually, through the chest and stomach, bites chewed slowly until flavors unfolded fully and gently. The soft salt of olives, the creamy, mild tang of yogurt, the faint, nutty warmth of sesame seeds scattered across the bread. Silence held comfortably for long stretches, broken only later by the quietest of murmurs. How the tea carried a subtle whisper of cinnamon today. How the olives tasted a shade more plump and juicy after the night air. How the light dancing on the fountain water seemed almost slower, more languid in this particular hour. Trays were cleared with the same careful, silent order. Plates nested without the slightest clatter. Glasses stacked inside one another. Everything balanced on trays and carried away in steady, unhurried procession. The palace then returned fully to its gentle, unchanging daily rhythm. In the embroidery halls, hoops were lifted from their exact overnight positions, fabric smoothed flat with open palms until every last wrinkle vanished. Threads were selected from the familiar wooden boxes, colors laid out in their unchanging sequence. Soft whites and creams first, pale pastels next, muted, deeper tones at the far end for only the smallest accents. Needles were threaded with the same, moistened tip guided through the tiny eye with a gentle pinch, then set to the silk once more. The work continued precisely where it had paused the day before. Another row of chain-stitch curling around a delicate vine tendril. Another satin stitch filling the rounded heart of a blossom petal by petal. Small seed stitches clustered in even groups for tiny, delicate centers. Each movement repeated without the slightest variation. Needle piercing down through fabric. Thread drawn through to the back. Needle rising through the next small hole. Thread pulled to the same gentle, even tension. A single petal might advance, by only a few millimeters over the course of many quiet hours, its shape emerging so gradually that change felt more like a slow, natural unfolding than any deliberate effort. Whispers passed softly between the cushions. A quiet remark about how the silk caught, the shifting light as clouds, drifted overhead without hurry. A shared note on the way the needle glided more smoothly after its night of rest. A gentle breath of satisfaction when a row aligned itself perfectly with the one before it. The rhythm remained unbroken, steady, soothing. The stitches existed simply to fill time with calm, predictable, meditative motion. In the calligraphy chamber, ink was prepared fresh once again, the stick circling the stone in slow, meditative loops until black deepened to its familiar, rich velvet depth. Paper was laid flat on low tables, corners held by the same small, polished stones worn smooth by generations of gentle hands. Brushes were rinsed in clear water, shaken once to remove excess, dipped, so bristles formed a perfect fine point, then lifted to the page. The morning's quiet focus might rest on the letter Ya, its two dots placed precisely above the gentle curve, the bowl swelling softly, then tapering to a fine upward flick. The brush moved again and again, each attempt laid beside the previous in tidy columns that filled the sheet, row by row without crowding or haste. The repetition allowed the wrist to relax completely, the eye to rest on the same graceful form, appearing over and over until drawing it felt as natural, as effortless, as the slow rise and fall of breath itself. Music drifted from another quiet corner. The same slow circling phrases on the oudi, or nay. Each note held long enough to let its resonance fade entirely before the next arrived. Fingers pressed strings with measured, unvarying pressure, releasing them to let vibration linger in the warm air. The melody returned to familiar passages, with only the slightest shift in breath or touch, creating a gentle sense of return and comfort rather than any sense of forward movement. The sound wandered along hallways and through open doorways, blending seamlessly with the fountain's endless trickle until the two became one unbroken, calming, continuous presence that filled the palace without effort or notice. In the gardens, sunlight filtered through leaves in soft, predictable dappled patterns that shifted only minutely as the hours passed. Gardeners continued their small, steady tasks. One tying young jasmine shoots to trellises with soft twine looped in the same loose knots. Another sweeping gravel paths with a broom of fine twigs that made a gentle, shushing sound rising and falling in even rhythm. Watering cans were tilted in slow, careful arcs, streams soaking the earth without disturbing the surface, allowing roots to drink gradually and deeply. Petals loosened by the gentle breeze drifted down one by one, caught in open baskets lined with muslin or left to rest on the ground until gathered, later into neat piles. Women walked the shaded paths at their own unhurried pace, pausing at the same low stone benches where moss had softened the edges over long decades. They sat watching the central pool, goldfish gliding in lazy, overlapping circles just below the waterline, water lilies floating motionless with petals half opened to the sun, a single fallen leaf spiraling down to touch the surface and drift without hurry. The air remained warm and scented with green leaves, warm earth, and the faintest trace of salt from the distant Bosphorus beyond the walls. No words were needed. The garden simply offered quiet space for presence, for breath, for letting go. The midday call to prayer drifted softly across the rooftops once more, gentle and familiar as ever. Prayer mats were spread in the same quiet rooms, aligned in the same familiar rows. Postures flowed through their measured sequence, standing tall, bowing low, kneeling, prostrating, each held long enough for breath to find its own calm rhythm. Water was poured afterward for ablution in the same gentle stream, hands dried on soft folded towels. Everything returned to its place without the slightest ripple or disturbance. Afternoon deepened into golden quiet. Some rested in shaded alcoves where cushions had been arranged just so, cradling the body perfectly, eyelids growing heavier still, breathing slow and even. Others continued their gentle occupations, needle moving through silk, brush dipping into ink, fingers plucking strings, each motion growing tinier, slower, more completely dissolved into the warm, unchanging light. Evening gathered in soft, gradual layers, gold softening to rose, rose fading to lavender, lavender deepening to deep indigo. Lamps were prepared with the same steady ritual, wick trimmed short with small silver scissors, oil added drop by careful drop, flame steadied until it burned low and clear. Dinner trays arrived with familiar, simple comfort. Pilaf, cooked soft with threads of saffron, vegetables stewed until melting tender, yogurt, plain and cool. Eating unfolded in near silence, trays cleared without rush, floors swept until every surface gleamed once again. Night drew closer gently. Curtains were drawn against the cooling air, beds smoothed with fresh linens, pillows arranged in the same soft, comforting piles. Lamps dimmed one by one, until only the faintest amber glow remained in the hallways. The fountain's trickle continued through the dark hours, repeating its calm, unchanging phrase over and over. guiding every listening soul deeper into peaceful, dreamless, unbroken rest. And tomorrow, the same tender dawn would arrive once more. The same routines would resume without the slightest alteration. The same soothing repetitions would hold everything steady, safe, quiet, and forever gentle. The 11th morning emerged in the same soft, unchanging hush, the palace seeming to wake only because the light had no choice, but to continue its gentle journey across the sky. Dawn lingered in pale silver gray a fraction longer than the day before, as though time itself had begun to stretch thinner, softer, more willing to pause. When the sun finally rose, its rays touched the distant domes first in faint gold, then slid downward in slow, familiar paths, filtering through the same pierced marble screens to draw the same slender, warming lines across marble floors that had never known haste. The air remained cool and clean, holding the faint damp trace of night on the garden cypress, needles, and the ever-present, low perfume of rose attar that had long ago become inseparable from every breath drawn within these walls. Attendants resumed their rounds with the same quiet, almost invisible certainty, footsteps merging so completely with the palace's own slow rhythm that they seemed part of the stillness, rather than any interruption. They carried pitchers of water warmed just enough to ease the morning chill, linens folded into precise rectangles with every corner aligned to the same invisible standard, small brass trays polished to a gentle, non-reflective sheen. Doors were eased open one by one with the lightest touch on the latch, windows unlatched, in their unchanging sequence, east facing first to receive the sun's earliest caress, then those overlooking the gardens where the breeze arrived freshest, softest, most predictable. Curtains of pale silk were drawn back inch by slow inch, fabric settling into long even pleats that swayed once or twice before coming to perfect, motionless rest. In the bathing alcoves, steam rose in thin, patient columns from marble basins filled drop by careful drop until the water lay mirror still, except for the occasional tiny ripple from a single falling droplet. Women stepped down into the warmth with the same measured grace, one foot lowered to test the temperature, then the other following, body sinking gradually until shoulders rested against the smooth, time-worn stone ledges that cradled them perfectly. Cloths of fine linen were soaked, wrung lightly to stop excess, then drawn across skin in wide, repeating circles, shoulder to arm to wrist, neck to collarbone. Rinse in the warm water. Repeat once more. The motion stayed circular, even, never quickening at all. The heat seeped in layer by layer until the body felt fully enveloped, weightless, held in absolute, unchanging calm. Towels warmed on heated racks were wrapped softly around shoulders and hips, absorbing moisture without pressure or haste. Hair was parted down the center with a smooth comb, oiled with exactly 3 measured drops rubbed between warm palms, then smoothed from roots to ends in long, deliberate strokes that left every strand lying straight, heavy and softly gleaming. Braids were formed again in the familiar 3-strand pattern. Sections, divided evenly, crossed over one another in slow, steady succession, pulled gently taut, secured at the end with a narrow silk ribbon tied twice and knotted flat so it rested smooth against the nape. The small hand mirrors reflected the same serene profile, eyes half lowered, expression peaceful and steady, ready for the day to continue its quiet mirroring of every day before. Breakfast trays were set. Beneath the colonnades where morning, sun now painted the same warm, repeating stripes across the floor tiles in soft gold. Glasses of tea stood steaming in their delicate tulip shapes, filled to the same precise level without variation. Olives rested in small porcelain dishes arranged in neat, overlapping rings. Yogurt lay thick and cool, swirled once with a thin ribbon of honey that caught the light faintly. Bread was torn along, its natural seams into pieces that fit perfectly in the curve of the hand. Eating moved at its own slow, unhurried pace. Sips drawn out so the warmth spread gradually through the chest and stomach. Bites chewed slowly until flavors unfolded fully and gently. The soft salt of olives, the creamy, mild tang of yogurt, the faint, nutty warmth of sesame seeds on the bread. Silence held comfortably for long stretches, broken only later by the quietest murmurs. How the tea carried a subtle whisper of bergamot today. How the olives tasted a shade more plump after the night's dew. How the light on the fountain, water seemed to move even more languidly in this particular hour. Trays were cleared with the same careful, silent order. Plates nested without the slightest clatter, glasses stacked inside one another. Everything balanced on trays and carried away in steady, unhurried procession. The palace then returned fully to its gentle, unchanging daily rhythm. In the embroidery halls, hoops were lifted from their exact overnight positions, fabric smoothed flat with open palms until every last wrinkle vanished. Threads were selected from the familiar wooden boxes, colors laid out in their unchanging sequence. Soft whites and creams first, pale pastels next, muted, deeper tones at the far end for only the smallest accents. Needles were threaded with the same moistened tip guided through the tiny eye with a gentle pinch, then set to the silk once more. The work continued, precisely where it had paused. Another row of chain-stitch tracing, the curve of a vine tendril. Another satin stitch filling the rounded form of a blossom petal by petal. Small seed stitches clustered in even groups for delicate centers. Each movement repeated without the slightest variation. Needle piercing down through fabric. Thread drawn through to the back. Needle rising through the next small hole. Thread pulled to the same gentle, even tension. A single leaf might advance by only a few millimeters over many quiet hours,